What's going on, everybody? It's your boy BJ, the DJ. You are now tuned into episode 2 of the Rewrap. We're here, guys. We're 2 episodes in. A lot of lessons learned from the first one. I realize I say a lot, and you can hear the smacking of my lips. So gonna adjust those things as we go along. We're figuring this thing out as we go, right? So episode 1, we brought you my personal top 10 list. It was up for debate in some areas, but overall, I feel like that's probably the most controversial topic in all of hip hop. Everyone's got a top 5 list. We extended it out to top 10 just because I wanted you to understand where I was coming from with my top 5. And some of you disagreed, which was great. Great dialogue. Appreciate everyone opening up discussion about it. But here we are. We're episode 2. And I want to talk about episode 2. I want to talk about one of the most iconic record labels of all time, and one of my personal favorite record labels. I know I invested a lot of energy and a lot of money in buying a lot of the projects that came out from this label. That's No Limit Records. No Limit Records took the hip-hop industry by storm in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. Master P, probably one of the most iconic CEOs. I hate to keep using the word iconic, but it's hard not to describe this label without using the word iconic. Master P really transcended the way we look at music, the way we package music, the way we released music. He changed the whole dynamic. You also talk about people talk about his split. He was at like an 85-15 split. Like, he was getting ridiculous money off each record. I think Snoop Dogg had said in one of his interviews, before Master P, there really wasn't any money in rap music. So I want to talk about No Limit, but I don't want to talk about their discography or anything like that, because that's a whole nother episode in itself. What I want to talk about are the top 10 most influential members of No Limit, based on tenure, based on album sales, based on exposure, because everyone knows they released a ton of projects within a good 3 or 4 year span. There was late 97 all the way into 98 was like the peak No Limit, but they had projects before and projects after. What I want to talk about are the top 10 influential artists that served tenure on the tank. Now, this excludes the groups like True, 504 Boys, things like that. This is basically solo artists or a solo group, however you look at it. But I want to talk about the top 10, my personal, and I think most people will agree. I think at one point there were about 33 artists at some point or another signed to No Limit. Wouldn't expect everyone to know all of them, but the ones I picked for the top 10, I think everyone would probably agree that these were the ones who you heard a lot, you heard about the most, their albums did the best. And then we're kind of ranking them. So this is kind of like the chain of command, so to speak. If you think about No Limit, you would think about, those releases, those iconic album covers, the pen and pixel graphics. They were very over the top, but they said a lot about the character or the artist. And just No Limit did a lot of things right. No Limit they were the first label that I ever saw wearing the chain, the chain logos on their necklaces that were iced out. They were the first ones I ever remember doing that. And then it now became a thing with a lot of rappers today. So before we get into the top 10, though, I want to give you 2 artists to me that were honorable mentions. And I think once you hear these names, you'll know kind of why they're honorable mentions. Not to say that they didn't play an impact in the growth of No Limit, but they, for some reason, just were on the outside looking in, give or take. So first up is Young Bleed. So Young Bleed had one album that came out, I think, in the beginning of 98. And to me, that's kind of what started the movement for No Limit. Or may have been late 97. Kind of vague on the timeline. Maybe in late 97, but around that 97, end of 97, beginning of 98 timeframe, Young Bleed dropped an album, and the sound of the Young Bleed album was completely different than anything No Limit had done at the time. It was different because I think P was approached by CeeLo to distribute this project with Priority. If you look at the graphics and the design of it, it looked similar to what the project CeeLo was putting out at the time. it had a different sound. It had a different vibe. With the exception of a couple songs that featured No Limit artists, Youngbleed's album was completely different than any other No Limit release. To me, it's one of my favorite No Limit releases. There were a lot of songs on there. Of course, it released one of the biggest No Limit hits with How You Do That there, which was originally a regional hit called Act a Fool that was released on the Concentration Camp album. But I think the fact that he only had one release on No Limit and very limited exposure, he wasn't on any of the Soldier songs or the group songs. He wasn't featured on too many albums after that. So I think just based on his limited exposure, I think it's safe to say that Youngbleed, although impactful with No Limit, probably needs to be excluded from this top 10 list, right? Second, and I know some people may not agree with me on this, but I got Cain and Abel. To me, Am I My Brother's Keeper is probably one of the most slept on No Limit releases. I feel like at any given point there were songs throughout that whole release that you wouldn't skip. Seven Deadly Sins was released probably 96, I think it was. It didn't have that big of an impact to me as opposed to the second release, but Cain and Abel were featured heavy on every project, and they did a lot of stuff with C Murder. But to me, they fall far outside of the top 10 list that I'm about to present to you. So not to say their impact wasn't significant with No Limit in their growth. I mean, I think their second album went gold. Their first album may have went gold too, I think. But they were all over No Limits releases, and the fact that they were twins kind of set them aside from everyone else. But based on this top 10 list I have, Cain and Abel kind of gets the boot, but they're still important to the growth of the label. At the same time, though, they don't fit in within the top 10 that I have listed, of course. So let's get started with the top 10. Coming in at number 10, I have Big Ed the Assassin. Again, he only had one album release with No Limit, one solo album release that went gold, and probably one of the most anticipated projects at the time, and I think one of the most heavily favored projects. He had some songs on there that people appreciated, but I think the fact that he only had one release and that it took so long kind of puts him at the bottom of this list. Now, he was heavily featured on a lot of No Limit projects. You can't exclude the fact Big Ed was a soldier through and through. He was actually one of the original members of the True Click back in like the Who's the Killer days and Understanding the Criminal Mind, like back in like the early 90s. He was one of the original members. So he had been probably one of the longest tenure soldiers on the tank at the time when his solo album released. But the fact that he only had that one release, and I'm not really sure what took so long to release it or why he only had one release, but he left shortly after that. And of course, he would pass away shortly after leaving No Limit, unfortunately. So R.I.P. Big Ed. We appreciate the Assassin project, but he comes in at number 10 for me based on those points alone. So number 9, one of my favorite No Limit soldiers, Soulja Slim. Again, his album was different. He brought a different dynamic to the tank. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he had ties to Cash Money, I think because of where he was from. But at the same time, P had him originally as Magnolia Slim on the Down South Hustlers compilation. Soulja Slim's album was completely different, and it didn't feature a lot of No Limit artists outside of Snoop. They had one song on there, I think, that had a few artists on it, but his album his debut album was really different than any other No Limit release. Now, he would go on to release another project, The Streets Made Me, after he got sent to prison. P put it out, didn't really have that big of an impact, and I don't think you can find it on any digital streaming platforms either. But Soulja Slim comes in at 9 for me. And again, one of my favorite soldiers. I think, again, he was another one that wasn't really featured on a lot of projects outside of his own. But again, great impact. I think his album went gold as well. The first one, the second one, I don't think it did big numbers at all. Again, he couldn't promote it; he was in prison. But he would be another one that would unfortunately pass away. He was murdered. R.I.P. Soulja Slim, one of my favorite No Limit soldiers of all time. Thank you for your contributions to the tank. He comes in at number 9. Number 8, again, another one of my favorites. Probably has my favorite No Limit release of all time. I got Mac. That Shell Shock project was probably, I don't care what anybody says. You could talk about Ghetto Dope, Last Dawn. You could talk about any other No Limit project, but that Shell Shock project, from start to finish, there were no skips. That's probably my favorite No Limit album of all time. And Mac's another one. He would get incarcerated. He would put out World War III afterwards, had a couple songs on it that would also be featured on other projects. Those songs didn't have the impact that Shell Shock had. Shell Shock's another album that went gold. And Mac was heavily featured on a lot of artists' records. There was a project slated to come out called Tank Dogs that had Snoop Dogg, Mystical, Mac, and I want to say Fiend was the fourth. And I really wish that project would have seen the light of day, but it didn't. But aside from that, Mac's contributions to No Limit, he was heavily featured. He got a lot of exposure. The Shell Shock project was very significant during that time when No Limit was at its peak. Mac is definitely one of my favorite No Limit artists. He's right up there at the top. You know, Mac was different than your typical No Limit artist. What Mac brought to the table that was missing before were bars. Mac actually, he did a great job of telling stories in his songs. You know, Shell Shock would go gold. World War III wouldn't do the numbers that Shell Shock did, but it didn't take away from the impact he made at No Limit during his time there. What I love now is that since Mac was incarcerated and has since been released, is we were at the No Limit tour a couple years ago when they came through Nashville, and they actually brought Mac on stage. This was right after he got released. So even if you are not a No Limit Records fan, check out some of Mac's newer stuff. Like, it's a little bit different, but at the same time, he's still barring you to death in every song. So shout out Mac, a great No Limit soldier, had one of the best releases of all time. I got him at number 8. So number 7 is my absolute favorite No Limit soldier, and that's Fiend. Fiend somehow, some way, always found a way to relate to the listener. Yeah, you could get the raw, gritty version of Fiend, or you could get a laid back, calm, chill version of Fiend, or you can actually get a Fiend who's going to share the struggle with you in a way in which you could relate. He was a very dynamic artist, and it didn't matter what type of song he was on, he was going to kill it regardless. He was heavily featured on a lot of projects, and to me, There's One in Every Family is one of the best No Limit records released. There were hits after hits on that project, but to me, he really came into his own on Street Life. His second album was way different than There's One in Every Family, and for me, it was a growth. It was showing the growth of Fiend over the time when There's One in Every Family was released to the time Street Life was released. Even then, after he left No Limit, he would go on to release a project with 3 6 Mafia called The Headbusters, which was a whole nother dynamic. And to me, I wish they would have continued that project and done multiple releases of that, because, I mean, what he did on 3 6 Mafia's beats was brutal. Again, Fiend, one of my favorite, if not my favorite, No Limit soldier of all time. Again, comes in at number 7, and the only reason I don't have him higher on this list is because of the number of releases, album sales, etc. The artists that come in at 6 through 1 sold more records, had more releases on No Limit. So you'll kind of understand when we get to that point, but it doesn't exclude Fiend. Fiend's, one of the best there ever was, not just during his time for No Limit, but very slept on artist in the South during that time. And to this day, still continues to put out quality music. So number 7, I got Fiend. Number 6, I got Mamma Mia. Mia X is one of the dopest female rappers of all time. I don't care what category you want to put a female rapper in. Very few can stand bar for bar with Mia X. And she's another one. She can get sexy with it. She can get raw with it. She can get lyrical with it. I mean, I don't think there was a No Limit project released without Mia X having a feature on it. Mia X had 3 albums released on No Limit, 2 of which went gold, and was significant in the growth. She changed the dynamic up. The songs she had No Limit artists featured on, she took on that mothering type role with the Tank, and they actually would lift her up on a pedestal as such. So you can't exclude her contributions, not just to No Limit, but to the rap game in general. One of the coldest female rappers ever to touch a microphone. Mia X, got her in at number 6. Number 5 is another very popular No Limit soldier. I got Mystical. And I'm telling you, Mystical was probably the most unique artist on No Limit. He brought an element of surprise. You didn't really know what energy he was going to bring. He was the tongue twister, the speed rapper of No Limit, which was very different than what was going on in New Orleans, which is kind of what set him aside. Mystical had a very successful career before even signing with No Limit in New Orleans. His Mind of Mystical project's probably one of the best to be released during that time, and I think it was gold. So he was an established artist before he even got to No Limit. I mean, Mystical would elevate the Tank to a different level with 2 platinum albums, and he would be featured on a lot of the big songs with No Limit. Make 'Em Say He was one of those artists that you knew was going to bring the energy level up, right? And he would even go on to have a successful career after leaving No Limit. He dropped another platinum album with Let's Get Ready, and then Tarantula went gold. He had some big hits like Shake Your Ass, Danger. He had Tarantula was another big one. He had some really big records after he left No Limit. So he's probably one of the most successful artists, aside from like Snoop, for instance, that would go on to be successful after leaving No Limit. Very few artists were able to do that, but Mystical was one of them that could. Coming in number 5, I got Mystical. Number 4, another one of my favorites, very popular, I got C Murder. C Murder, of course, the brother of Master P, currently incarcerated. Hard to say what would have happened had he not got locked up. He had some of the hardest No Limit releases of all time. He had some of the hardest songs he put out. He had the hardest beats. He sometimes had the hardest verse. Or Life or Death is a great debut album, was one of the best No Limit releases. But to me, my favorite C Murder album is Bossellini. He had 27 tracks on that album, and it didn't stop from track 1 to 27, even the skits. Probably, top 5, top 6, maybe top 10 releases from No Limit. Went platinum. You can say what you want about C Murder, him being P's brother or whatever, but the man had a following. People loved C Murder. They loved his music. And I mean, he lived that. And ultimately that would be what kind of got him in the situation he's in. So, I think people are working behind the scenes trying to get that reconciled and get him out. But, hopefully we get some new music from C Murder. I don't know what it'll sound like at this point, being that he's been locked up for well over a decade. But yeah, C Murder is one of the most popular. Of course, he was heavily featured on True projects, and he's another that's been around from the jump. I mean, it's P's brother. So, yeah, C Murder definitely contributed to a large part to the success of No Limit, and he's very popular. So I've got him in at number 4. Now, this is kind of where it gets a little weird because people may think, why is he so far down? And I think you can kind of tell where it's going from here, right? If I got C Murder at 4, who do I have at 3? I got Silk the Shocker, right? 2 platinum albums, 1 gold. He was the guy that P was pushing to the moon, right? He had a number 1 single. He also got a feature from Jay-Z. Silk was kind of seen as the lyrical guy, although some people that's up for debate, right? To me, he kind of fathered a style like your Bluefaces and guys like that would rap. He would have a way of kind of speeding it up, but he was kind of a little offbeat in the way he delivered everything. But he sold records, which was nuts. He was the pretty boy of the group, but he also brought you the raw gangsta lyrics that you liked from No Limit at the time. But he was a playboy, you know what I mean? He was the guys that ladies loved, and he put out music sometimes that catered to the ladies. Again, 2 platinum albums and a gold album. That's 3 solid albums. And not to say his other projects, like the Shocker project was dope. My World, My Way was dope. Like, he had projects that came out after that just didn't do numbers because No Limit was kind of on a decline. But he was as good as they get. I mean, anybody who gets a Jay-Z feature, especially during that time, was seen as kind of being a big deal. Now, I know it was probably a tit for tat thing, like P did something for them and yada yada, but at the same time, Silk has a song featuring Jay, and it's not a bad song at all. So I got Silk at number 3. So I know what you're thinking now. If C Murder comes in at number 4, Mystical's at 5, and I got Silk at 3, who could I possibly put it to? So at number 2, I've got Snoop, and Snoop comes in at number 2 because he had 3 multi-platinum albums while with No Limit. He was featured on everybody's project. When Snoop came on board, it changed No Limit. It elevated No Limit. It was the first big signing that wasn't a homegrown talent from New Orleans. He brought Snoop on at the right time. Snoop had Doggy Style, which is one of the greatest debut albums of all time. Then he had The Dogfather, which went on to sell multi-platinum. And then he left Death Row and found a home with No Limit. When Snoop came in, they gave him the royal treatment. Now, he returned the favor by his first album, The Game Is to Be Sold, Not to Be Told, which was a Snoop Dogg album with a No Limit twist. It had No Limit style beats. It still had the West Coast vibe to it, and they did a really good job of accommodating Snoop with the beats that they made and the songs and the features, etc. But you could tell then off that first album that Snoop was all in with No Limit. It was a pen and pixel design art graphic, which they did great capturing Snoop's essence at the time, and the features. It was heavily No Limit produced, and then by the second album, by the time that the Top Dog dropped, Snoop was kind of catering to his own style at that point. There were less No Limit features. It was less about the production from Beats by the Pound and guys like that. He was starting to get back to the essence of being like Snoop. Now, the last project he dropped, The Last Meal, was all in on Snoop. Snoop was working with Timbaland. He was working with Dre again. He was getting back to being like Snoop. He gave No Limit 3 solid releases that elevated their catalog's value. It put plaques on the wall. It put money in people's pockets, and more importantly, it got Snoop back to being Snoop. So shout out P for making that signing, and shout out to Snoop for really doing his due diligence to elevate No Limit the way he did during his tenure. So that's why I got Snoop at 2. I know he's not the family, and I know he only had 3 releases, but he was on everybody's project, everything, and some of the biggest records in No Limit, right? And it just, Snoop sounded like he was having more fun back then. So I put Snoop at 2 for that reason. He's probably the most successful artist outside of No Limit, of course. He was successful before he came in, was continued to be successful as he left, and it continues to this day. Snoop is probably the most recognizable person in all of hip hop and rap, right? So, number 1, of course, I got Master P. And Master P comes in with 3 platinum albums, 2 gold. He's the kernel of the tank. He's the one that kind of facilitated everything. To me, he's the greatest CEO of all time because of how he treated his artists. A lot of people, the only negative thing they ever say about P is that P's focus went elsewhere, and it was less about No Limit music and more about making other things happen. To me, that's not a bad thing. I mean, how are you going to show growth if you can't expand your portfolio? Again, I think that's the reason I got P. You can talk about, his albums. You can talk about the way he raps. You could talk about the content. But the fact is, the man gave us Ice Cream Man. The man gave us Ghetto Dope. And he helped birth one of the greatest record labels of all time. All right. That's why I got P at 1. That's it. That's No Limit's top 10 artists and how they influenced the tank. Let me know what you think. Let me know if I got it right, who I left off, and where I left them off at. And that's it. Let's discuss it. Let's get to it. This has been the Rewrap, episode 2, Chain of Command. I'm BJ the DJ. Catch you on the B-side.